Hello, and welcome once again to Know Before You Go, a program of the Dominican Central Province of St. Albert the Great that allows us to take a look ahead at the upcoming weekend's readings. I am Father Jim Marchionda, Provincial of the Chicago Dominicans, and I am happy to be with you once again as we approach the 13th Sunday of Ordinary Time. We have arrived at Ordinary Time. After all those wonderful Sundays of Easter, the feasts of the Ascension, of Pentecost, of the Holy Trinity, and last weekend of the body and blood of Christ, we are now into Ordinary Time. And as I have said before, Ordinary Time is that time of the liturgical year where ordinary Christians work out the nitty-gritty of what it means to be Christian and what it means to follow and live according to the Word of God, which is why we focus on it week after week and day after day, so that the Word of God can have a greater impact in how we actually live our lives. For this Sunday, the 13th Sunday of Ordinary Time, the three readings are from the first book of Kings, from St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, and from the Gospel of St. Luke. Now, because it's Ordinary Time and because there is so much to work out, the themes are numerous on those three readings. And as I've studied them and prepared to share some thoughts with you today, I've realized that the first reading parallels the second half of the Gospel, whereas the second reading is matched beautifully with the first half of the Gospel. So, going to the first reading from the first book of Kings, we hear the story of Elijah being taught and told by God, instructed by God, to appoint Elisha as his prophet, as the prophet to follow in Elijah's footsteps. And so it's a wonderful story, and Elijah goes over, and to name him as prophet simply throws his own cloak over him. That's the symbol. That's the sign. He throws his cloak over him, and Elisha realizes that he is now to step into the role of prophecy. And he goes back and he kisses his mom and his dad goodbye, and he destroys his plow, and he slaughters all the oxen that he was tending. And he gives to the poor, he gives to those in his own region the food that comes from the slaughtering of his oxen. He lets go, he renounces, he relinquishes everything in his life so as to take up his role as a prophet of God. That in itself is such a beautiful teaching and the call to every disciple. The more we learn about God and the more we desire to follow God, the more we learn what we have to let go of in order to follow God and in order to be a disciple. Elisha gives us that example right at the beginning of our readings this weekend. The second half of the gospel is the same. The Gospel from Luke is a story about Jesus and his disciples on their journey to Jerusalem. And somebody runs up in the second half of the Gospel and says to Jesus, "I will follow you anywhere." And Jesus says, "Oh, will you?" He says, "The Son of Man has nowhere to rest his head. The foxes have their dens, their lairs, the birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has no one." Meaning it's going to cost you something. It's not easy to be a disciple. And then he goes to somebody else and he says, "Follow me." And just like Elisha, who went back to kiss his mom and dad goodbye, the man in the gospel says, "Let me go and say goodbye to bury my father. My father has died." And Jesus says, "Leave the dead to bury their dead." Sort of a tough saying for us to hear, always uncomfortable for us to hear that kind of statement coming from the mouth of Jesus. But he's not meaning it to be non-loving of one's family. He's meaning it to encourage us to understand the depth of importance in following Jesus. He's not trying to diss family and family love. He's trying to highlight and raise to an absolute ideal and goal what it costs and what it means to follow Jesus. It requires everything. It requires often much more than we want to give or than we even consider giving. Following Jesus costs us something. And Jesus is letting them know that right in his response there. And he says to them, you cannot set your hand to the plow and then look back. Once we cling to Jesus, we need to hold on, and we need to let go of anything that interferes with our embrace of Jesus and the message that comes to us from the mouth of Jesus. So we can see how the first reading from 1 Kings and the second half of that gospel parallel each other so well in just being called to discipleship and being willing to give up what we need to give up to be the disciples of God in Jesus Christ. Now the second reading and the first half of the gospel really parallel each other beautifully. The second reading is from St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, and it's talking about Christ setting us free. Not free to be crazy, not free to fulfill all of our own passions and whatever we want to do, free to serve one another in love. That's what you're going to hear. Christ has set us free. For what? To serve one another in love. Not to serve our own passions and all our own desires and our flesh and all those kinds of things, but we are free in Christ to serve one another in love. And he says, it's all summed up in one little phrase, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then he goes on and he gets real practical, like ordinary time wants us to get. And he says, so quit biting and devouring one another. I love that line. Quit biting and devouring one another. It's all summed up in you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, you want to get to some real hard nitty-gritty of what it means to be Christian? Pay close attention to the first half of the gospel. Because the first half of the gospel is about Jesus and his disciples on their journey back to Jerusalem, and they come to a Samaritan village. And Jesus asks to remain there for a while. And the Samaritans, when they learn he's headed for Jerusalem, reject him, because the Jews and the Samaritans have such a history, centuries-old history of hating each other, judging each other, and rejecting each other. So the Samaritans, when they learn that he's a Jew and that he's going back to Jerusalem, want nothing to do with him, and they do not offer him hospitality and allow him to stay there. James and John, two of his disciples, are so angered by this. They say to Jesus, Lord, shall we call down fire from heaven to destroy them? And the gospel says Jesus turned and rebuked them. He rebuked them for thinking such nonsense. No, he taught them, you do not destroy just because they are mean to you or are evil toward you. Your response, now that you're with me, cannot be destruction. Wow, what a teaching, huh? What a teaching in this day and age. A teaching between enemies, that those of us who are Christian have alternatives to fighting, that we have alternatives to the passion of anger, that we have an alternative to the passion of resentment, or the passion of anything warlike at all in our thinking. Don't we need to hear that today very, very seriously? I look at the news every night and I listen to all of the saber rattling that's going on between the United States and Iran, for example. And I think, come on, no. Those of us who hear the gospel need to hear a different message than saber rattling. We need to stand for a different teaching and a different solution to the problems of the world. Those of us who hear Jesus and who are willing to follow Jesus have to pay the price of letting go of some of our own passions that might interrupt or interfere with our embracing of the full message of Jesus Christ. The Samaritans treated Jesus terribly. And James and John, loving Jesus as much as they could, said, should we call down the fire of heaven on them and destroy their whole town? And the gospel says Jesus rebuked them. Jesus said, no. Think of another way. And in that is linked totally with Galatians' teaching, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, so quit biting and devouring one another. People, let's get practical. This is a wonderful Sunday for us to take all of the feasts that we've celebrated these last couple of months, a wonderful Sunday to put them all into the context of what we are hearing. And now you and I are called to discipleship just like Elisha was, and just like people in the second half of the gospel were. We're called to discipleship, and we are called in that discipleship to let go of anything that will cause us to not be able to embrace the fullness of Jesus' message. Jesus does not accept war. Jesus does not accept biting one another and devouring one another. We Christians must pray for a better way, a way that is more in line with the gospel. God bless you all.